Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, and entertainment and give you my thoughts. If you're joining us live, super happy to have you. If you, at any point during the show, you have any questions or comments about any of the topics I'm covering, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on those. And please hit the like button. I guess it helps with the YouTube algorithm. So if you could spare a measly like for a poor soul of me, that would be really helpful. If you're watching this after the fact, same deal. Super happy to have you. Feel free to leave a comment. Please like the video and subscribe if you're not already, so that way you never miss one of these shows. We do this every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. So why don't we just jump right into things? Okay, let's take a look at the box office from this past weekend. Total domestic box office for the weekend, $73 million, which I believe is a 14% jump from the week before. I just wrote in my notes, 17%. But what does that mean, Peter? It looks like it's a jump, right? So it's this past weekend was a little bit better, kind of officially starting off the summer movie season. In terms of stuff opening, at number one, The Fall Guy, the kind of action comedy starring Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt, directed by David Leitch, the guy who directed Bullet Train and was like one of the uncredited co-directors on, John Wick, Atomic Blonde, things like that. And this, despite coming in at number one, is being kind of declared as like a disappointment. Because it only brought in about $29 million, despite the original projections being closer to like 30 to 40 million. So it just barely missed those kind of expectations, right? And again, this is a little bit concerning considering that it was made on a $125 million to like $150 million budget. So, it has made $65 million worldwide. So it looks like more than half of this film's worldwide box office is coming from outside the United States, which makes sense because action is easy to export, right? It doesn't matter if people know. I'm sure there's subtitles if you're watching this like in France or China or wherever, but, the prime reason why you like it or would like a movie like this are the action set pieces, right? I suppose it's harder to export a dialogue-heavy comedy, right? And this is also very dialogue-heavy comedy, but, there's going to be different cultural differences and nuances, so those don't always do as well. But this is, I think, makes a lot of sense that this is being successful around the world. I went to go see it. My review is going to be going up, I think it's on Wednesday of this week. You can go check that out at cinemancuso.substack.com. I have a little plug for my Substack newsletter where I post reviews. I thought it was quite good. I didn't think it was great, but I thought it was a lot of fun. And kind of like the perfect starter to the summer movie season. So it's a little disappointing that it kind of had a little failure to launch here in terms of at least meeting those expectations. But maybe that word of mouth will kind of help propel it. But I don't know, though. Now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm not sure because, again, this is a very crowded period in the box office. You know what I mean? Like next week, we're going to have the new Planet of the Apes movie, and then we really get into late May and June and July. It just seems like this has the potential to really fall flat in its face. But only time will tell. Coming in at number two is not really a new movie. For the 25th anniversary, we have Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, being re-released. So this is not the first time this has been re-released, because I remember when I was in high school, and this is before Disney bought Lucasfilm and basically thwarted all these plans. They released Episode 1 in 3D, which, kind of dates when this was. This was like the 3D craze. I want to say like 2011 maybe, or 2012. And the plan was to release all six, because at the time there was only six, all six of the films 1 year after the other, re-release them in theaters in 3D. And I think they only did this first one, The Phantom Menace, and then Disney bought Lucasfilm, and then they were just like, we're not going to do that. We're just going to scrap that plan. But here we have it now for its 25th anniversary being re-released, bringing in about $8 million for the weekend, coming in at number two, $8.1 million. Again, I didn't expect this to do gangbusters by any means. And Though I am surprised it didn't do a little bit better, though. I think maybe if this was like Revenge of the Sith, maybe. I think people like that one a lot more than the Phantom Menace or Attack of the Clones. But this definitely shows that there is obviously like the prequel reevaluation that we as a society have been doing, or people have been trying to do, clearly has taken root in some respect. And then another film opening this week at number 4, we have Tarot, like the horror, kind of like generic horror film. Brought in about $6.5 million for the weekend, which fell right into the projections. I projected it would come in about $5 to $8 million. And this is off of an $8 million budget. And it's made about $10 million worldwide. So, it didn't make a lot of money. And I mean, it's just came out. So, we'll see if it has like a gigantic drop next week. But, that's the beauty and allure of making cheap, mediocre horror films, is that they're cheap. So even a return of $10 million worldwide, that goes a long way in recouping your costs, right? In terms of films continuing this week, we have at number 3, Challengers, dropping from the first spot to third in its second frame, bringing in about $7.6 million. This was a 49% drop, and I'm really surprised about this, that this film has had has so much buzz about it. At least kind of like on film Twitter, if you will. I thought it was really great. I saw it last week. My review is going to be going up it's going to be going up tomorrow, Tuesday. I thought it was great. And that kind of hype on social media was warranted. But I guess it is fizzling out in ways that even I didn't expect. So, this $7.6 million for the weekend brings its domestic total to $29 million, and its worldwide total to $52 on a $55 million budget. So again, it still has a long way to go to recoup that budget. Ideally, you want to double your budget to break even, to include like marketing and advertising costs. So, it still has a long way to go to doubling a $55 million budget. Also continuing, we have the kind of Christian music film Unsung Hero coming in at number 7. Talk about a drop, dropping from 2nd to 7th. It's only in its second weekend, which is not surprising though, because this has a very limited appeal, right? 61% drop, only bringing in $3 million for the weekend, and this brings its domestic and worldwide total to $13 million. But it was only made for $6, right? So it has doubled its budget. So this is, in a sense, it has recouped its cost. It's more or less broken even. So, if it can keep kind of... And films like this, I feel like they make most of their money on streaming and direct-to-video, especially like Christian households, and they're all going to get together and they're going to rent this or watch it on Netflix or whatever. So, this isn't the end of the financial story for this movie. A couple other of movies of note here. We have Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire, in its 6th frame, still in the top 5, but dropping from 3rd to 5th, only bringing about $4.5 million for the weekend. And this was only a 38% drop. Again, it's been holding very steady. Like I said, it's in its 6th frame. This brings its domestic total to $188 million, and then worldwide $547 million. So it is this, and just off of $150 million budget. So this has definitely been successful. Which is interesting because I feel like people have gotten sick of movies like this. Not in terms of the genre, the content, but just again, like big budget franchise movies that, are being made just to be made. Right. But audiences clearly like this. This is definitely one of the most successful films of the year so far, right? Also want to note, films. We still have some films here that have stayed in the top 10 for a long time. So at number 8, we have Kung Fu Panda 4, bringing in just $2.4 million for the weekend. Dropped from 7th to 8th, but it's been out for 9 weekends now. This is its 9th frame, and this was only a 33% drop. And off of just an $85 million budget, this is also one of the most successful movies of the year, bringing in about $188 million domestically and $520 million worldwide. Also, another film in the top 10 that's been here for a good long time at this point. Also, way more of a surprise than Godzilla X Kong still being in the top 10. This one's surprising at number 10. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, bringing just a very humble $1.8 million, dropped from 8th to 10th in its 7th frame. 45% drop. But again, this is surprising because I've made it very clear. I feel like Ghostbusters is not the brand that Hollywood thinks it is or wants it to be. And also this didn't get great reviews, and it just didn't seem like audiences really cared for it, but it's made about $110 million domestically, $195 million worldwide off of a $100 million budget. So it's nearly doubled its budget in terms of its worldwide gross. So, you know, maybe it can break even, but again, this is really surprising that this is still in the top 10. And you know what's not in the top 10? Dune Part 2. It has fallen. Our favorite, your favorite son has dropped out of the top 10, which is disappointing. But who knows? Maybe one of these films like Unsung Hero is going to have a huge drop again and get knocked out. Maybe Abigail and Ghostbusters are going to get knocked out. Maybe Dune will just again keep it slow and steady. Because now I'm curious. Let me pull this up on my end. I know you can't see it, but looking at the box office, so Dune still came in at number 12, right? Bringing in less than $1 million though. So, there's some films ahead of it that I could see dropping. So, for example, like I don't know if The Phantom Menace is going to be staying in theaters into the next weekend. I could see Tarot having a huge drop, Unsung Hero, Abigail, Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which came in at number 11. So Dune could come back in, maybe even just at number 10. But that's probably wishful thinking on my part. Really doesn't matter. As of right now, I believe it is the most successful film of the year. But that is, that still remains to be seen. It is only May. We still have more than half of the year to go. But we did see Barbie and Oppenheimer be the highest grossing movies, right? So there's still some time for a film to kind of snatch that first place spot for the year. Okay, just want to give a quick plug for my reviews. Like I had mentioned before, Cinema QSO is not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I review new films coming out in a more written review format. The review from last week I wanted to plug is my review of Abigail. I thought it was fun. I thought it. I'm surprised it's not been having as strong of a box office presence. But that's just the way it is for sometimes for movies like these. I feel like this maybe wasn't the best release date strategy. But you can find that review in the link in the description, or you can just go to your browser, type in cinemanqso.substack.com. So let me just grab a quick drink before we continue. Okay. So I'll just give you I'll just say right now that this was kind of a slow news week. so some of these stories are going to be shorter, but I do think they're interesting, and we can kind of sometimes it's quality over quantity, right? So let's start with story number 1 here. The Senate of the United States Variety has held a hearing on what's called the No Fakes Act. And of course, Congress and the Senate, they love to come up with these acronyms for their bills. So No Fakes stands for, quote, nurture originals, foster art, and keep entertainment safe. So it's like, I feel like, well, what came first, that or No Fakes? I feel like they came up with No Fakes and they figured out, well, someone pull out a thesaurus. So how can we make this work and have it make sense? So the kind of purpose of the bill would be to provide guardrails and regulation on the technology that powers deepfake technology. So if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, deepfakes have been around for a while, a few years, kind of predating the AI craze. But deepfakes are essentially a way to, through computer imagery, map a person's face onto another person's face, or just replicate a human being in a highly detailed and realistic way. Not always, but again, like I said, often superimposing it. So you could use me and then deepfake Joe Biden onto me, right? And then, using AI voice technology, I could say stuff that Joe Biden wouldn't say, I love big booty Latinas or something ridiculous, right? Well, I'm sure he does. I mean, who doesn't? But so the idea of the bill is that individuals, particularly celebrities, right? But I guess it would extend to all individuals. Individuals would have quote, digital replication rights, end quote. And Deadline notes that these rights would, not only be for the person, but that once they pass away, that these rights would extend to their heirs, executors, or assignees of the deceased person for a period of like 70 years. So it's almost like like intellectual property, where like a book will enter the public domain like 70 years after the death of the author or whatever the rules are, because they've been changed a lot, over the years, as corporations want more longer periods of time where they have the exclusive rights to something. Disney. But the idea would then be that people and companies and platforms could then be sued for producing or hosting quote unquote digital replicas, right? Or rather unauthorized digital replicas. And of course, this is a huge concern for the entertainment industry, which is why I'm talking about this, particularly for individuals, right? Because we've been seeing this with virtual personas or deep fakes of celebrities. Sometimes they're very benign and harmless, and they're funny. Like the classic one I feel like is like Joe Biden and Donald Trump like playing Fortnite or Call of Duty, whatever it is, like together and like trading, jibes, and kind of digging on one another. And it's kind of funny and it's all in good fun or whatever. But the other end of that can be really, heinous. So it's like, I remember earlier this year, I believe, or maybe near the end of last year, there was like a fake Taylor Swift sex tape going around on Twitter. And Twitter, to their credit, quickly acted. I remember it was kind of dumb, though, because basically they didn't, because Twitter is now a shell of its former self, so their only solution was, we're just going to mute anyone talking about Taylor Swift. Which I guess solved the problem. At least it was a Band-Aid solution. But in any case, so this is a big problem that individuals and politicians are concerned about, right? And legislation it's going to be very interesting and tricky to kind of figure this out, because the technology is moving faster than society can even wrap its head around the potential ramifications of the technology. And then and then let alone the legislation being able to be passed, right? Like government in America just moves so slowly unless the politicians stand to benefit directly. If that's not the case, it's going to take a really long time for anything to ever actually get passed into law, right? So it's like, before we can even figure out a solution to a problem, 5 new problems have arisen when it comes to this kind of technology. And there's currently no law that would punish people for creating deep fakes without permission. So there were a few, cast of characters that came to the Senate hearing to kind of voice their support or their opposition to this bill. And I feel like the big one was music phenomenon. Well, she's not really a phenomenon. She's pretty, not indie, but I don't think my parents would know who she is. FK Twigs. And she kind of made this, she wrote this kind of letter or speech or what have you. And she's talking about, she plans, because the bill isn't about getting rid of this technology. The bill is about ensuring that people have the rights to their digital likeness, right? So she discussed her plans to develop a fake AI version of herself, right? Oh, excuse me. I have this quote here from her saying, quote, "In the past year, I've developed my own deepfake version of myself that is not only trained in my personality, but also can use my exact tone of voice to speak many languages," which, sidebar, I think is the coolest application of this technology. So instead of needing to have people dub movies, like you could just have Tom Cruise's voice speaking Chinese or French or whatever. Anyway, back to the quote. "I will be engaging my AI Twigs," which is kind of funny, play on her name. I will be engaging my AI Twigs later this year to extend my reach and handle my online social media interactions whilst I continue to focus on my art form. Whilst I continue to focus on my art from the comfort and solace of my studio, end quote. So, I think she's touching on an interesting point here, that the technology is, as with almost every piece of technology ever invented ever in human history, it is neither a positive or a negative, it's a neutral tool. And it's how these tools are used or applied is what, it's the actions taken with the tools that are good or bad, not the tools themselves. So, I think she's touching on an interesting point here, that the technology could be extremely useful to artists. But again, so long as they control the rights to their digital likeness And we have her continuing here saying, quote, "What is not acceptable is when my art and my identity can simply be taken by a third party and exploited falsely for their own gain without my consent due to the absence of appropriate legislative control," end quote. So that makes a good, I think Miss Twigs makes a good point, right? This idea that, other people could, like, I could find ways to apply this and help my brand, but people with the current legal framework, or rather say with the absence of a current legal framework, anyone could just take that and use it for their own purposes, right? So that's a pretty compelling argument. On the flip side, we do have some opposition to no one serious is opposed to banning deepfake porn, right? That's not or rather unauthorized deepfake pornography. No serious person is going to be against that. But there are some concerns here being brought up, and some of these are kind of like, okay, you're saying that because you stand to lose some money if this goes through. But I think there is some truth to some of these comments. So we have some perspective. We have a perspective here from Ben Scheffner, who's the senior vice president of the Motion Picture Association. And he spoke saying, quote, "Legislating in this area involves doing something that the First Amendment sharply limits, regulating the content of speech. It will take very careful drafting to accomplish the bill's goals without inadvertently chilling or even prohibiting legitimate, constitutionally protected uses of technology to enhance storytelling," end quote. And he brings up, and I never even thought of this, but he brought up a really good use case example of why this could be dangerous. And he points to Forrest Gump, in that film's use of, this large array of, like, this cast of digital historical figures, right? So, like, iconically, it's like George Bush, what's his name? Forrest Gump meets John F. Kennedy, and they get to have an interaction. And, like, through very early mid-90s, technology, being able to, like, change JFK's mouth to say what they need him to say or whatever. But here's the quote from Scheffner saying, quote, "To be clear, those depictions did not require the consent of their heirs, and requiring such consent would effectively grant heirs or their corporate successors the ability to censor portrayals they don't like, which would violate the First Amendment," end quote. That's really interesting, right? So you could see this going forward where with the FKA Twig scenario and saying, wanting that control, but then, down the road, decades after they've passed away, the family could gatekeep that access to make sure that they're being presented in the way they want to be presented, as opposed to maybe how they were, or to capture something about how they were, their essence, right? And Scheffner essentially feels like, whether it comes to, a actively misleading or negative portrayal of a real person, or any kind of sexually explicit material using deepfake technology, Scheffner feels that current laws already protect against most of those concerns, right? So all this would be to violate free speech. That all of the concerns everyone is talking about there's already laws in place. They're not specific to this technology, but they're all kind of in the same ballpark, right? And there's just like a general concern from studios and people like Scheffner of like, how realistic does it have to be to now become illegal, right? Like, we're talking about these digital likenesses that are like photorealistic and photo accurate, but what about parody, right? Like, The Simpsons is famous for parodying famous people and celebrities since it's aired in like the late 80s. Are those going to now be illegal? Is it now illegal to have a Simpsons cartoonified version of someone? Or is it literally only referring to content that is so realistic that it is intentionally trying to mislead you into thinking it is the person, right? That's an interesting legal gray area that I don't know if we again, as we as a society, I don't think by the time we wrap our heads around this question, the technology is going to advance that there's going to be so many other. It's like whack-a-mole. By the time you whack one of them, 3 more pop up, right? And just to be clear, at this time of at least me talking to you guys about this is tentative legislation. This may not even move forward, but this is just a hearing to kind of see, getting those different perspectives. Okay, just hold on one second. I'm sorry. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink. Okay. Let's talk about story number 2. So, SAG-AFTRA, the Screen Actors Guild, and then I forget what AFTRA stands for. But essentially, the Actors Guild, famously went on strike last year. You may have heard about it. SAG-AFTRA has made a deal with Nielsen data to provide third-party data on streaming. This would be using Nielsen's streaming content rating service. And the parties said that this data will, quote, complement first-party data from streaming platforms and serve as a consistent and comparable lens through which the performances of streaming titles across various distribution platforms can be analyzed, end quote. So why is this happening? What's even going on here? So the context is, like I had kind of, sardonically mentioned before, you may or may not be aware, SAG-AFTRA struck a deal with Hollywood and the Hollywood studios in November after 118 days on strike, which I believe was a record for the union. And part of the deal was incentive bonuses tied to streaming results. So, if you're on a streaming show and it does really well, there's potentially an incentive for you to get some extra money. And this was a really big deal because, unlike with the box office, which is more or less regularly reported pretty transparently because there's multiple parties involved, because there's the studios, there's also the movie theaters. Excuse me. This was a big deal because streaming services typically don't report those numbers of like how many people were watching this show. And when they do, it's usually in their favor. Like there's no requirement to disclose this information, right? And as part of the deal, the streamers still want to maintain that privacy in terms of like public awareness of those ratings, but the streamers agreed to share some data privately with the union. So what does Nielsen have to do with this? So Nielsen, you may have heard of if you ever heard people talk about TV shows and television prior to streaming, talking about like the ratings. Oh, the show had really good ratings. Like, oh, the ratings sucked or the ratings tanked. Right? They're usually referring to the Nielsen rating. So Nielsen is a data company that has tracked television ratings for decades. So, through various means, right? So in the old days, like with streaming, it's really easy, right? Because Netflix can literally just see how many people are watching Netflix. Pre-digital, and then even into the digital age, it was harder to figure out, like, in 1963, how many people are watching this show at 7 o'clock, right? So Nielsen had a few different methods. Like one was like a meter, and I think that the technology of that evolved over time. But the central idea is, this thing that you would hook up to the TV that would monitor what you're watching when and flipping through the channels. And then that data would then be given to Nielsen, right? And then also would have user self-reporting, right? So again, unlike Netflix, if 700 million people watch something, and that's like a ridiculous number, but let's just say that, Netflix knows exactly how many people watched it. With that method that Nielsen has had to use, there's some level of statistical extrapolation, right? They have to kind of say like, okay, based off of this data, and if we assume this applies to the entire American population, then we can estimate roughly that this many people were watching this show at this time, right? And that's really important for, advertising for television. That's how networks and cable channels sold advertising slots. They understood the value of a particular slot because they were able to say like, well, this many people were watching, so they're probably going to have this many watching it again, right? So, but obviously Nielsen's tactics have had to change in this new streaming era. Hollywood Reporter notes that it can be hard to track this data due to quote unquote walled gardens. Again, Netflix it basically has all of the info. Like they have more info, but they're much more closely guarded about it, right? So it's harder for Nielsen to get their hands on that data. And again, it also makes it hard because like you could even if you do some kind of modern version of like the meters that's tracking like what apps you're using and what shows you're watching or whatever, people watch things on multiple devices, right? So you might wake up, eat breakfast, and watch something on Netflix on TV, on your television, and then as you commute to work, you then pull up the same movie on your phone and keep watching it, and then you get to the office, and then in between stuff you're watching on your laptop at work. So it just gets like way more complicated. So the idea of this deal between SAG and Nielsen is, it strengthens the union's leverage against the studios, right? Because they're like, oh yeah, sure, we'll make these streaming bonus incentives, and we'll let you know what shows are popular and how many people are watching the shows, right? But ultimately, in that model, the SAG just kind of has to take Netflix's word, right? Or I don't want to just focus on Netflix, but that's like the obvious example, right? But it's not that Netflix would probably completely lie, but they could fudge the numbers to a statistical error just enough so that no one's really noticing, and it could just shrink that amount of money that they would owe to actors or the director or whoever it would be, right? And again, of course, the Nielsen data, because it's an estimate, is not going to converge with what Netflix is telling the union. It's not going to be exact, but ideally, the idea of this is to kind of have that other, second opinion, in that way. So ideally, they should be in the same ballpark. Right. General orders of magnitude. Like if Netflix is saying 200 million and Nielsen's saying 300 million, like, okay. But if Netflix is saying 50,000 and Nielsen's like, no, it's more like 5 million, that's a problem, right? And again, this just speaks to the larger problem. It would just be great if we just had access to these metrics, to these metrics and this data. But again, they're pretty closely guarded about it, because it's a double-edged sword. Because if they release that info publicly, if the numbers are really good, that's gonna really help Netflix's stock price. But then if they're not good, it tanks, right? So I think they just made the measured decision. It's better just to not open Pandora's box, because once we start disclosing this stuff, we can't stop disclosing it. Because then if we stop, people are gonna complain. And then that will be a sign that something's wrong, and that will send the stock price down. So, again, I think this is it just gives more accountability, or forces streamers like Netflix to have a little bit more accountability. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay. I told you these stories were shorter. Okay. Let's talk about story number 3. So, Dave & Buster's. I haven't been to a Dave & Buster's since I was like a kid. I wonder if they're any good now. Oh, that's not true. I actually went as an adult recently, but it's exactly as you remembered it. Dave & Buster's will now, and by now I mean at some point soon, and not like today necessarily. Dave & Buster's will now allow guests to bet money on the outcome of arcade games. Let me say that again. Dave & Buster's will now allow guests to bet actual currency on the outcome of fucking skee ball that you're playing with your friend. So they're going to be teaming up with, I guess, a company Lurka, who describe themselves as, quote, a technology provider of gamification services, end quote. And that's startup lingo for, we're going to make gambling, we're going to help you introduce gambling to your customers, essentially. A great, way to introduce children at a young age. Though they won't be able to. It is for people 18 and older, to be fair. But, it's I guess another way to kind of diversify Dave & Buster's income. The wagering would be done in like the DMB, if you will, the DMB's app. And the goal of this move, aside from just like making money, but is to keep people at the locations longer and spend more money while they're there, right? Because I could totally see, you might play an extra game of pinball or whatever it is. Because it's like, like double or nothing, right? And even if that's just one extra game, if everyone's kind of doing that, that's going to be a lot more money in the pinball machines. And then also the gambling, so I'm sure they'll take like a little cut of that. Of like whoever wins that wager, they'll probably skim something off the top. We have a quote here from Simon Murray, who's the Senior Vice President of Entertainment and Attractions at Dave & Buster's, saying, quote, "This new partnership gives our loyalty members real-time, unrivaled gaming experiences and reinforces our commitment to continuing to elevate our customer experience through innovative, cutting-edge technology," end quote. Again, that's very corporate speaky for essentially people are easily prone to gambling. So we're going to introduce it now. There will be a cap on how much money you can wager on any given game, but that, as of right now, that's unclear what that would be. They just said there would be a cap, but we don't have that number. And the reason why I wanted to do this story, or talk about this on the channel, rather, is I think it is less interesting for its own sake, but speaks to a larger trend in what I call entertainment spaces. Right, so things that I would include, and this isn't even just entertainment, but, arcades, movie theaters, malls to an extent, which sometimes overlap with those two. These places, I know we're talking about, this gambling and this wagering is, geared towards people 18 and older, but, these places I've mentioned here, they used to be like the go-to places for young people to congregate. They were places where you could go. And essentially, if you didn't want to spend any money, you don't have to, right? Theaters maybe not as much, but it depends on what kind of theater it was. If it had kind of like a little lounge or area or what have you. And in a lot of ways, it was like when people talk about the idea of third spaces and how we don't really have third spaces. And this idea that, you have your home and you have your workplace, and there's very little. Most Americans don't really have a third space, that they're really just going from one to the other. They don't have that place. And for a long time, malls were that. In Europe, think of like the town square, or, like a cafe that people would congregate. Places for people to go and have different kinds of interactions than they're going to have at their workplace or at their home, right? And, these industry, theaters, malls, arcades have been dying, right? As entertainment spaces. And obviously they've had their ups and downs, and film obviously is interesting because film and the theaters are very intertwined businesses, but are not the same businesses. But especially you can't argue that malls and arcades have not plummeted in terms of their attendance and popularity over the past, couple decades, really since like the 90s. But then arcades, especially with like the 2000s, like, with your computer, you really don't need to go to an arcade. Aside from the social element, which again, I'm speaking to here, that, this move here by Dave & Buster speaks to that effort to reinvent these traditional entertainment spaces. So, movie theaters are trying to trying to reinvent what they are, what they could be. So a lot of theaters now have little bars. Specialty theaters like Alamo Drafthouse, like they'll bring you like full ass meals to your seat during the movie. Malls are trying to incorporate, more interesting and bigger and better entertainment offerings. And similarly with arcades, again, the arcade hasn't really innovated in decades, right? So I'm against this. I'm not really against or for this. I think it's just, I don't think it's going to make anyone a gambling addict. It's just going to reinforce bad habits. And, at the end of the day, though, it will be something that could potentially add to the experience and kind of make it a little bit more fun with your buddies that you haven't seen in a couple months or maybe a couple years. You're just grabbing some drinks and stuff, and you're playing some, like I said, skee ball or whatever. So I think that could be interesting, but I know this was definitely a move that people were making fun of online, and I don't blame them, because it is a kind of a strange decision. But maybe in 10 years we'll all be like, I can't even imagine adult. But also, how many adults are going to an arcade? And I'm not shaming it, I'm not putting it down. But like, I've been to some arcades in the past couple of years, but it's always been like a novelty, right? Who is going to an arcade regularly? Where it's like, we need to spice this up. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I just don't have access to arcades or good arcades. I don't know. But that's just me. Okay, let me take a quick drink here. I told you these stories were going to be short, but this is like the one big mammoth story here. So let's talk about story number 4. I have been talking on this channel about the saga of Paramount being bought, being merged, being sold, whatever you want to call it, since I started the channel. One of the very first stories I did was talking about Bayer and Allen potentially buying Paramount. I probably made like 6 or 7 videos about this. And the saga keeps continuing. So much happened this past week. just when I thought things were finally starting to get into like, finally kind of settling into like what's going to happen, so much happened this week. So big thing that kind of started off the week, the CEO of Paramount, Bob Bakish, was removed from Paramount. And the board of Paramount's board had been contemplating his removal for quite some time, right? Yahoo notes that, some of the board members were displeased with the way he rejected offers to sell Showtime and BET, the Black Entertainment Network. The latter being to Byron Allen, funny enough, right? And he was also causing issues because he was reportedly opposed to this Skydance deal. This deal with David Ellison's company, Skydance Media, to essentially have Skydance take over not only Paramount, but Paramount's parent company, a National Amusements owned by Sherry Redstone, the Redstone family, right? And this deal has been getting a lot of shit, for lack of a better word, from shareholders because it primarily would benefit Redstone. So the fact that Bob Bakish was kind of opposed to this deal, that really put a strain on that relationship with Sherry Redstone. So his exit was officially announced on Monday. He technically stepped down. So it's one of those situations where it's like, did he step down? Did he resign? Was he removed? Was he fired? It doesn't really matter. All that really matters is that he's gone, right? Variety, though he's not completely gone, because Variety notes that he will still be a, quote, senior advisor, end quote, through October during the M&A process, the merger and acquisition process. And in his place, he's been replaced by 3 high-level executives within the Paramount global corporate empire as the, quote-unquote, office of the CEO, until they can, get a permanent CEO. That will probably not happen until after this whole merger saga. And Variety notes that, insiders felt that this was the right move, that he needed to go, but it does make an already chaotic M&A process more chaotic. And it did send the stock price down slightly. Nothing huge. I don't think Wall Street was like, Bob was the only thing keeping this thing together. I don't think people felt that way, but just, again, more so the chaos is concerning for shareholders. And this also was timed with Paramount releasing their Q1 earnings from the beginning of this year. They added 3.7 million new subscribers to Paramount Plus, bringing its total to about 71 million. And it narrowed its streaming loss, to about 286 million. So they still lost almost $300 million on streaming, but it was better than Q4 of last year, which was like 500 something million dollars. And they spoke about, on the earnings call, they said they believe Paramount Plus will turn a profit in 2025, which, okay, great, but it's May of 2024. There's still a long time before that moment of profitability. And this was only a 10-minute earnings call. They took no questions, did not really address the Bob Bakish thing beyond just kind of like some simple comments. And then at the end, they played the Mission Impossible theme song at the end, instead of answering any questions. So they're definitely in the mode of just like, we're just going to keep our nose down and we're just going to try to get through this. And we don't want to face scrutiny from some shareholders here. So again, on the table now are still these 2 primary offers, right? And I think the last time I did a video about this, it was about one of them. Basically now a second has entered the field, but let me just kind of cover these 2. So the first major deal here is the Skydance offer, like I mentioned before. And again, like I had said, shareholders are not happy about this deal for a number of reasons. So Sherry Redstone and David Ellison have made changes to the deal to address some of those shareholder concerns. So some of those changes included a $3 million cash offer of shares, and this would be at a premium, so that would help the financial health of the company. Ideally, I think the idea would be that this would go, as much of this as they can get would go towards debt reduction as opposed to like buybacks, right? And it would also, this revised deal would also include increased premiums for non-voting Class B shares. So again, those are the kind of shares or type of shareholders that were really going to be screwed by the original Skydance deal. And Ellison's made clear that this is his best and final offer. That it's either take it or leave it at this point. Skydance-Paramount had been an exclusive negotiating window, but that ended last Friday on May 3rd. So it's still kind of up in the air what's going to happen. They did not elect to renew the window, so that could potentially mean things are, maybe falling apart, right? And like I said, normal shareholders are not into this deal. And one of the shareholders in Paramount, the Employees Retirement System over Rhode Island, of all places, and I'm from Rhode Island, why is anyone's pension tied up with Paramount Global? But anyway, so the Employees Retirement System of Rhode Island is asking for a court order to look at Paramount's, documents or records regarding this deal, because potentially some investors are like, if you go through this deal, we're going to sue you because you're not, Sherry Redstone, you are doing this to benefit yourself and you're not fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility. So that's one offer. The other offer, the newer offer, is this Apollo Global Management Sony offer. So originally, Apollo Global Management, which is like a huge private equity firm, made an offer on just Paramount Pictures and maybe Paramount Plus for like $11 billion or something, and Paramount turned it down because they want to keep everything together. Then Apollo made another deal for $26 billion for the whole thing. It was also turned down. And then they came back with Sony, the Sony, being involved as well with the offer. So at the time of me talking about it, I think it was maybe a week or two ago, no formal offer had been made, right? They have now formally made an offer. Well, technically it is a, quote, non-binding expression of interest, end quote. Still for $26 billion. Variety notes that this is a premium over the company's $22 billion enterprise value. And the way it would probably be structured is that Sony would be a majority holder and Apollo would be the minority owner. And the New York Times notes that, a benefit to this is that Sony would be insulated from volatility in the film industry, because they are not primarily a film company, even really a media company. Like at their core, they're a hardware company, like they're a consumer electronics. So they, are a little bit removed from like the whims of the industry, which might be really beneficial to kind of like keep ahead. What's the phrase? Like kind of keep the course, stay on course, right? And this would be an all-cash acquisition, which is, again, really appealing to some of these shareholders that are not so hot about the Skydance deal. But Redstone does not like this deal. Sherry Redstone does not like this. She's worried about asset liquidation. Again, she wants to keep the media empire her father, Sumner Redstone, built over decades. And it's likely Sony would eventually ditch some of these things under Paramount Global. And she's also concerned about potential job loss. Because again, with the Skydance deal, Skydance would kind of become a, owner of Paramount, but Paramount would still kind of exist as it is. Whereas in Sony, it would become just another pillar in its media empire, which includes also like Columbia Pictures, right? And then there's also regulatory concerns, right? Because again, because Sony is, of course, a Japanese company, and Paramount owns CBS, like the broadcast network. And the FCC in the United States has rules that a foreign entity cannot own a certain percentage, more than a certain percentage of a American media company like CBS. So there would be regulatory concerns, but these are solvable problems. These are not insurmountable problems. They could do something where it's like, okay, Apollo is the majority owner in CBS, and then Sony has control of the other stuff. There are ways around it, but that would be something that would have to be figured out. But it seems like Wall Street likes this idea way more, and Paramount's stock price jumped about 13% following the news of Sony and Apollo making a formal offer. So right now it's kind of like this, this or that, but Forbes makes the good point that Redstone could just decide not to sell at all. Right? It's only this or that if you go in with the assumption that a sale is going to happen no matter what. It's just a matter of who. Sherry Redstone could just throw up her hands and go, you know what? Okay, shareholders don't like the Skydance deal. I don't like the Sony deal. Screw it. We're not going to sell. Variety notes that insiders, like I was saying, say neither deal may come to fruition. Again, for different, like I was saying, the Skydance deal will invite litigation from investors that feel betrayed. And then the Sony Apollo deal could break up the company and face regulatory scrutiny. If they don't do a sale to someone, their stock price is going to tank. And that's just my personal prediction, but I think that's pretty obvious, right? Because, it's if after all this drama nothing happens, I think investors are really going to lose faith in Paramount because what is going to change? The reason why they're doing this sale is because Paramount's value just keeps dropping and they just can't get their shit together. So I think the idea was like, let's sell it, and then someone else can kind of bring in some fresh ideas or whatever, an influx of cash or whatever. If we're at the point where selling is like the last option. So if a sale doesn't happen, as an investor, I'm like, well, what's going to change? You're just back where you started, but now there's even less hope for things to get better because, like, okay, nothing's going to change. The Hollywood Reporter reports a quote from a high-level executive from a rival media company. We don't know who it is. It could be one of many people. But this high-level executive said, quote, what did they say here? I'm saying, quote, Sherry cannot not do one of those deals. If things continue to spiral for them, you're going to sell this thing for pennies on the dollar, more than they are now. How can you not take an exit ramp now? End quote. Exactly. I completely agree, unnamed high-level executive. Because, again, well, you know who this would benefit are any other potential buyers. Because, again, if the price goes down, now you might have old buyers who can now come in with a new deal or a new offer, or new buyers that weren't even in the mix before because it was too expensive. But then if the price goes down, then maybe now it's like, okay, we can make this work. So that would help those people. But again, for the company, it's just all going to tank. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. Warren Buffett, of Berkshire Hathaway, like the iconic investor, has sold all of his shares in the company. It sold all of its shares in Paramount. So when Warren Buffett has completely, kind of like cashed in the chips and walked away, you might be in for some rocky financials, at least in terms of the stock market. So what would happen if they don't make a deal? Like, they may not sell, but maybe they could still make some kind of strategic partnership. Maybe they can work on a joint streaming venture with Peacock, which has been talked about. I think I did a story on that months ago. The Hollywood Reporter notes that, those two services could be really complementary, whereas Paramount Plus skews more male, Peacock skews more female, though Comcast would want control of such a service. And they probably would be able to, because Comcast just has way more, leverage and power than Paramount does, or Sherry Redstone does. But only time will tell. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen here, but David Ellison's dream, pictured here, over there, David Ellison's dream of maybe owning Paramount may be fizzling out, according to, I'm reading the writing on the wall here. Okay, let me just grab a quick drink. Okay. Last story of the night, story number 5. A report from The Economist shows that sex scenes, and yes, you heard me right, sex scenes. Oh, egad. Sex scenes in American films have declined 40%. That's a big percent. The way they kind of figure this out was they assembled a list of the 250 highest grossing films of each year, starting in 2000, and then kind of indexed which ones had sex scenes or sexual content or what have you, right? And films in 2023 had just over 60% of the erotic content found in the year 2000's top 250. In terms of like specific genres, action films saw a 70% decrease. So our action films are so much more sexless than they were maybe like in the 90s or the early 2000s, right? And romantic films, which, did not have as big of a decrease, but still saw a 20% decrease. And the films with no sexual content jumped from 18% in 2000 to 46% in 2023. So this is a really interesting sea change. And it's weird because you would think that as we've become more comfortable with sex in movies and media, you would think that number would be going up. And in a sense, TV shows I feel like have way more sex now because, a lot more shows are on Netflix or HBO and they can be R-rated or X-rated or whatever they want to be. But this, I think, speaks to the kind of the puritanical relationship that we as Americans have with sex that, regardless of your religious affiliation, is just embedded in our country's, cultural and psychological identity, rooting back to the Puritans in the 17th century, right? Going back 400 years, America hates sex. But it loves violence, and that's always been the interesting thing about American movies is that, you can have a very violent movie, and it'll be like PG-13. And then a barely sexual movie that just has like a fairly sexually explicit scene will be R. Sometimes X. It'll be rated X, or now it's NC-17, right? And there are these stories where it'll be like something that is obviously sexually explicit, but it's not like pornography level. But movies talking about like, well, we had to cut this scene, otherwise they would give us NC-17 rating, which is a problem because the reason why the ratings matter is that movie theaters have all agreed, like, we will not show movies rated NC-17. So it completely torpedoes your movie if you can't get that R rating at least, right? But in America, we're more than happy to have violent scenes for children, violent movies for children to watch, again, being PG-13. And I think this makes sense, though, because it speaks to, studios want these films to appeal to the lowest common denominator, right? So just in America, the more people can go see your movie, the more money you're going to make, right? So if it has more sexual content, it's going to be rated R or even just PG-13, and that's going to limit who can come see the movie, right? But in addition to that, even looking outside the United States, because we export a lot of our films to other markets, sexual content may prohibit international distribution in big money-making markets like China is like the big one, right? So that could cause problems, right, for the bottom line. And this is not just like, oh, our movies are getting more moral or squeaky clean or whatever, because the report also shows that other vices, and it didn't list what vices those were necessarily, at least in like the, from what I was reading in terms of my research, though depiction of other vices are not declining at the same rate. So it's not just like all films are becoming a little more family friendly, like specifically sex. So again, there's a lot of reasons why this could be happening. Like I said, America hates sex but loves violence, so we're willing to have that trade-off. Another thing people always point to is like Gen Z Puritanism. Like you'll see a lot of people like Gen Z kids, and I guess some of them now are just like adults. And I say this like I'm not Gen Z. I was born in 1997, so depending on what source you're reading, I'm either millennial or Gen Z. I consider myself a zillennial, which is a real thing. You can look it up, where it's, again, it's kind of like elements of both of those generations. But in any case, you see a lot of commentary from Gen Z people online, especially like TikTok, talking about like, oh, like that, like there's too much sex, like I don't want to see sex in movies or whatever. And like there's this real pearl clutching kind of attitude that the younger generation has. So that could be also part of it, that, tastes have changed. But then also, honestly, I think the main reason for all this is just an increased sensitivity, which is a good thing, right? Filmmakers and producers have a better, and again, still, we've made progress, but most filmmakers and producers statistically are going to be men. But those men have a better understanding of how sex has been used in film to objectify women. So some filmmakers and producers maybe think twice about having a sex scene because at its core, it could be reinforcing the male gaze and, using women again as objects of sexual desire, as opposed to being like a scene of like two consenting adults sharing in something. This also tracks with like the rise of on-set intimacy coordinators. So like people making sure that, sex scenes are being done with like preparation and choreography and coordination. So that way, you don't have someone, like if someone's going to touch your butt, you want to know that. It shouldn't just be like, oh, it happened in the moment. Like that's something that should be choreographed the way like a fight scene is planned and choreographed. So that no one, in a fight scene, you make sure it's all choreographed so no one gets physically hurt. But I think with sex scenes, you need that choreography and coordination from an intimacy coordinator to make sure no one gets emotionally hurt or sexually hurt or psychologically hurt, right? Because you don't know what someone's triggers might be. You don't know what they might be comfortable with. So I think that also I think this all speaks to why sex scenes have declined so much in film, that people are just, whereas maybe back in the day, they would have just thrown in like a really cheap sex scene. I think now filmmakers, like if it's going to be in there, it's going to be like a sex scene and have a lot of thought put into it. It's not just going to be like this kind of thrown together thing where it's like really focused on like a woman being really hot and sexy, right? So I'm not really against any of this. There is something to the idea of like, because Hollywood films were sexless for years, they had a lot more sexual tension, right? So, like the filmmakers got really good at like capturing sexuality implicitly. So like the way people look at each other, or the way that you shoot a scene or edit a scene, it, really can capture the sexual tension and desire between two people. So like maybe we just need to like get good, you know what I mean? Like filmmakers just need to get better at that, and maybe they have. And there's ways, for example, like Challengers that just came out is a very sexy movie, but there's like no sex scene, right? So I think that's a great example of like sex being this thing that can be great subtext, but it's good we live in a society where it's not forced to just be subtext. It could be more explicit. And by explicit, I don't mean like sexually explicit, but just more like on the surface. Okay, let's take a look at the upcoming releases. We have Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the fourth film in like the rebooted Planet of the Apes series. I'm kind of excited about this. I really liked the rebooted series, but I didn't love it. But I'm going to try to rewatch it, at least those three. I've never seen the originals, though. Maybe I should watch like the very first one. So I'm interested to see what happens with this one. The trailers have all been pretty good. The VFX look really great, especially of this guy here. And it's tracking right now to make about 45 to 58 million, which would definitely be like a good, healthy opening. It would definitely be below, I think, what the other films open to. But again, we're just in a different era of the box office. So, I think they could just take what they can get at this point. And then we also have this like spoof movie called Not Another Church Movie. I don't know. I know nothing about it. I'm not sure if I'll even see it. It looks awful. It's tracking about 4 to 8 million. So maybe it'll surprise us. Maybe it'll disappoint. But frankly, my dear, I do not give a damn, as one Clark Gable would say. Okay, this is the part of the show where I give a shout out to the best film I watched this past week. It could be a film I've seen a million times. It could be something I've seen for the first time. It could have come out 100 years ago. It could come out yesterday. Whatever the best thing I watched this past week, I want to give a shout out. And today it's going to be Casablanca, the 1942 iconic romantic film. They just had the juice. They were just cooking with gas. I don't even know what to say. Like, what can I say about Casablanca that hasn't been said? It's just a phenomenal movie. It's lean. It's like not too long. It's super character driven. And I just find it really compelling. So if you've never seen it, if 80 years later, however long it's been, highly recommend you check it out. I think it's available on HBO Max maybe, or it's somewhere. It's easily findable. Okay, just want to give a few quick plugs here. I have a sister YouTube channel called Peter Squared, where I take a more deep dive into topics related to film, media, entertainment in a more like written video essay format. The video I have up right now is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at Frozen and kind of take a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these two cartoon versions of my young and older self. It would really be a huge help if you could go check that out, subscribe, and like the video, and you can find that in the description below. Also want to give a plug to the podcast I do with my fiance Viviana called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We just wrapped up our huge season on the Batman franchise. And in the next, I think, week or two, we're going to be starting up on the Addams Family. So highly recommend you check that out. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube if that's your preferred way to listen to podcasts, but you can also just find the link in the description below. And then finally, I just want to give one last plug to Cinema and Q. It's not just a YouTube channel. It started as and still is a Substack newsletter where I write, formally written reviews of newer films coming out. That's how I got my start with Cinema and Q. It would really be a huge help if you could go check that out. You can find the link in the description below. You can also just find us at cinemanqso.substack.com. That's it for this week. Super happy to do this with you every week. It's always a big highlight. And I'll talk to you all next week. Peace out.